Imagine a facility so secretive it didn't exist on any map. To the locals in Pingfong, it was just a lumber mill. To the Japanese Imperial Army, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But to the thousands of souls trapped inside, it was a factory of nightmares. We like to think of history as a series of battles, soldiers clashing on fields for glory or land. But some of the most horrific casualties of World War II never saw a battlefield. They died in white-tiled rooms at the hands of men with PhDs. This is the story of Unit 731. It's a story about what happens when science loses its soul, and when a government decides that human lives are just raw material for progress. The mastermind was Shiro Ishii. He wasn't a frontline general. He was a brilliant, eccentric, and deeply ambitious microbiologist. Ishii believed that modern warfare wouldn't be won with bullets, but with biology. He saw the plague, anthrax, and cholera as weapons more powerful than any tank. To Ishii, the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned chemical weapons, wasn't a moral boundary. It was a proof of concept. If the world was so afraid of these weapons that they had to ban them, then he had to have them. Inside the walls of Pingfong, the victims were never referred to as patients or even prisoners. They were called Maruta, which translates to logs. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a psychological tool. If you are a doctor trained to save lives, how do you justify cutting open a living person without anesthesia? You stop seeing them as people. You see them as wood to be processed. The demographics of these logs were diverse: Chinese civilians and soldiers, Russian POWs, and even some Europeans. No one was spared. Men, women, children, and pregnant mothers were all subjected to the same clinical cruelty. The experiments were wide-ranging. They wanted to know the limits of human endurance to help their own soldiers, but they did it in the most sadistic ways imaginable. They would place prisoners in high-pressure chambers to see how much the human body could take before the eyes literally popped from their sockets. They would take prisoners outside in the dead of the Manchurian winter, douse their limbs in water, and leave them until they froze solid. Doctors would then strike the frozen limbs with clubs to hear the metallic sound they made. Once frozen, they would try different methods of rapid defrosting, often involving boiling water, which caused the skin and muscle to peel right off the bone in a single layer. We have to talk about the vivisections. This is the part of the history that is hardest to stomach, but it is central to understanding the depravity of the unit. The doctors believed that the process of decomposition, or even the use of anesthesia, would taint the results of their research. Therefore, they performed many surgeries, removing organs, limbs, or sections of the brain, while the victim was fully conscious. One former member of the unit described a typical procedure. A prisoner would be strapped down, screaming. A doctor would stuff a towel into their mouth, and with one quick slice of the scalpel, open them from the chest to the groin. They wanted to see the live progression of diseases. They would infect a prisoner with the plague, wait a few days, and then cut them open to see what the lungs looked like while the heart was still beating. They also performed surgical practice on healthy prisoners. They would amputate limbs and attempted to reattach them to the opposite side of the body. They would remove the stomach and sew the esophagus directly to the intestines to see if the subject could still digest food. In some cases, parts of the liver or brain were removed piecemeal over several days to see how long a human could survive while their internal systems were systematically dismantled. Unit 731 wasn't just a lab, it was an arsenal. They developed plague bombs, porcelain shells filled with fleas that had been fed on plague-infected rats. In the early 1940s, Japanese aircraft flew over cities like Ningbo and Changde, dropping these porcelain bombs along with contaminated grain and cotton. The experiments didn't just happen in white-tiled rooms. At the Onda testing site, prisoners were tied to wooden stakes arranged in concentric circles. Japanese planes would fly overhead and detonate anthrax-filled shells at various altitudes. The goal was to find the perfect kill zone radius. Those who didn't die from the initial blast were taken back to the lab to see how long it took for the shrapnel-induced infection to shut down their organs. It was ballistics, but with human flesh as the target. They weren't trying to blow buildings up, they were trying to start an epidemic. Thousands died. These weren't clean military deaths. These were slow, agonizing deaths from the Black Death, spreading through families and neighborhoods. The researchers from Unit 731 would often enter the cities afterward, wearing rubberized hazmat suits, to study the effectiveness of their work. They also contaminated water sources and distributed poisoned chocolates to hungry children in the villages. One experiment involved lashing prisoners to stakes at a testing ground called Onda. They would detonate anthrax-filled shells nearby to calculate the exact number of people infected by the shrapnel and the resulting bacterial cloud. After the war, you would expect these men to be hunted down and tried for crimes against humanity, much like the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. But that's not what happened. As the Cold War began to simmer, the United States became terrified that the Soviet Union would get their hands on Ishii's research. The US didn't have a biological weapons program as advanced as Japan's, and they wanted the data. In exchange for full immunity from war crimes prosecution, Shiro Ishii and his staff handed over their records, the thousands of slides, the autopsy reports, and the data gathered from the Maruta. The US government justified this by saying the value of the data was too great to lose. They argued it would help defend against future attacks. But many historians argue that the data was actually of little scientific value, as it was gathered under conditions that were neither controlled nor ethical. It was a deal with the devil that allowed some of history's worst monsters to walk free. Why was the US so desperate for this data? You have to understand the climate of 1947. The Soviet Union was closing in on Eastern Europe. The US feared that if Shiro Ishii fell into Soviet hands, Stalin would have a biological arsenal that America couldn't stop. They traded justice for security. The data they received, thousands of slides of human tissue, was shipped to Fort Detrick. Some historians argue this data jump-started the Cold War's secret biological programs. The blood of Unit 731 victims became the foundation of modern biodefense. For decades, the existence of Unit 731 was a hidden history. Many of the doctors who worked there didn't go to prison. Instead, they became prominent members of the Japanese medical establishment. Some became deans of medical schools. Others founded pharmaceutical companies that still exist today. One former unit member even became the head of the Japanese Medical Association. Shiro Ishii himself lived a quiet life and died of throat cancer in 1959. He never expressed remorse. He never faced a judge. It wasn't until the 1980s that the full scale of the horrors became public knowledge, thanks to brave whistleblowers and historians who refused to let the logs be forgotten. Today, the site at Pingfong is a museum. It stands as a cold reminder of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge is detached from the pursuit of morality. We study this not to be edgy, but to ensure that the names of the victims, the people who were turned into logs, are remembered as human beings. The story of Unit 731 forces us to look at a terrifying truth, that humans are capable of anything if they can convince themselves that the other isn't human. It challenges the idea that science is always good. Science is a tool. In the hands of someone like Shiro Ishii, it becomes a weapon of mass destruction. If you found this deep dive into history important, consider subscribing. We cover the parts of history the textbooks often gloss over, because the truth, no matter how dark, is the only way we avoid repeating it.